Good to have you with us on the show today. It does seem like this summit has been heavy on optics, symbolism. Has anything really been achieved substantially?
I think that, as with many things, but certainly these types of events, the symbolism is probably the product. And what's quite interesting is for all the ways in which the Trump administration, President Trump, especially in this second term, have really broken norms domestically and internationally, this particular trip looks very classical, almost like it could have been any other president's trip to China.
Interesting that we heard from Jameson Greer that a lot has been achieved in terms of a rebalancing of trade between the two countries. Is this a new norm? I mean, it's not about expansion of trade, it's rebalancing, trying to recover what's been lost.
I think what is interesting is a lot of people don't fully appreciate when the Trump administration talks about rebalance when it comes to trade. It is another way of saying that they are looking to create new winners and losers, different winners and losers from a longstanding policy here on trade. So I know they always point to the trade deficit, and that is one indicator, a very easily understandable indicator, usually represented by a single number. But when I hear Ambassador Greer talk about the need to rebalance trade between the United States and China, I appreciate that he's talking about more than just the trade volumes. He's talking about the trade volumes, but more than just the trade volumes. And I think that that is actually a really important standard to be applying to this summit and whatever outcomes may be coming from it when it comes to trade. At first glance, it does not look like, from the symbolism around the summit to the personnel that are brought onto the summit, to the private sector delegation that is accompanying the president to this summit, it does not look like a real rebalance is happening. If anything, this looks like more of the same, and maybe even a more extreme version of what came before Trump in terms of the U.S.-China trade relationship.
Should you be talking about winners and losers when what's been agreed upon back in Busan have not even been fulfilled? If you take a look at the commitment from China to buy 25 million metric tons of soybeans, that has yet to be fulfilled. How do you talk about winners and losers at this stage?
I think that's a really good question. And let's talk about who's winning and who's losing. When you look at the soybean trade, I think American soybean farmers are going through an enormous amount of anxiety in this year. Not only is the trade with China uncertain and a point of anxiety, there's been special deals cut with Argentinian farmers, the big Argentina bailout that has come at the expense of American commodity farmers. There is also the overall challenge that we have in terms of rising prices in the United States, and then the challenges with access to fertilizer supplies. So it's one thing to look at a particular metric when it comes to a dollar amount for what China may or may not be committed to purchasing, whether or not they purchase it. It's another thing to put those numbers into the context of what is happening in the U.S. economy and what is happening for the actual producers, consumers, and workers in this economy. You wouldn't know by watching the footage and watching and listening to the talking points coming out of this summit that the U.S. economy for ordinary middle-class people is going through a significant amount of disturbance and turmoil today.
Ambassador Tao, you can't help but look at the numbers. I mean, just a deal to do with those Boeing jets, 200, when, the market was actually looking at 500. Is also a far cry from the big patches that was made back in 2017 when Trump was last in town. That was 300 jets. I mean, how are you reading all these numbers and the kind of commitment perhaps China may or may not be showing in terms of trade with the U.S.?
I think that this is a very obvious performance that is going on both sides, on the U.S. side and the Chinese side, taking place on the stage in Beijing. In terms of those Boeing purchases, China has owed Boeing purchases going all the way back to 2020, and that first phase one agreement that was inked between the Trump administration, its first term, and China. Those purchases have been held in abeyance for these past 6 years. And when you look at that context, then set aside the expectations around and the comparisons to the number of jets that were purchased before. But if you look at the number of jets that haven't been purchased, that 150 number looks terrifically modest today.
It's not just about soybeans and jets. It's also about chips. We know that the addition of NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang came pretty last minute. We also know that the U.S. has greenlit H200 chips. I mean, how are you reading that, bearing in mind that, the U.S. has talked about national security, and here it is, green lighting the H200. How do you square that?
I'm not sure how they square it, and it's the job of this administration and the leaders in terms of economic policy, national security policy, foreign policy, to square that. It is very unclear to me as an outsider watching the signals what the principles are that this administration is pursuing on behalf of the United States in navigating this enormously consequential but complicated and difficult relationship with the People's Republic of China. There is clearly a need for a reset in terms of the relationship. I think that the overall tone of doing deals, and these very, very wealthy CEOs going on this trip to Beijing really undermines any message that this administration has put out there around the hard realities and the hard truths that need to be spoken between Washington and Beijing.
What's also interesting is the fact that despite the U.S. green-lighting the chips, China ain't buying. I mean, it speaks to the deep distrust, doesn't it?
It does. It speaks to deep distrust. It speaks to a growing dysfunction in this relationship, which I agree is imbalanced. The People's Republic of China is the world's largest producer and manufacturer and exporter of goods. The United States is the world's largest importer and consumer of goods. When you look at this particular relationship, you see the degree of distortion and mutual reliance that these two economies have on each other. It is driving a very significant economic unhealthiness and political disturbance here domestically in the United States. And I don't see any of those issues on the table being taken up in these conversations with China.
Do you see further decoupling between the U.S. and China, especially in technology, and is that decoupling perhaps irreversible now?
You know, it's really hard to say whether I see it or not. Again, going back to the lack of clarity around the principles driving this relationship for this administration. I did hear in the clip the piece about the Board of Trade being about a U.S.-China conversation around the goods that the United States wants to sell to China. I did not hear Ambassador Greer include chips in his list of products, and yet there are at least two big semiconductor company CEOs on this particular trip trying to sell their product to the Chinese.
And we know that U.S. chips are being used as a leverage for the U.S. If the Chinese continue to refuse to buy the H200, do you think the U.S. runs the risk of losing this leverage?
I I don't know. I mean, I think there's the H200 chips, right? There's the AI chips. Interesting to see that other than Elon Musk, none of the AI CEOs are on this trip, and part of that is because the AI company CEOs are driving a narrative that they need to receive all of the benefits from the U.S. government and the U.S. taxpayer in order to outcompete China. There are a lot of, when you look at the actual signals that are coming out of these few days in Beijing, there's not a clear signal that comes out for discerning people like your Bloomberg viewers, and I don't know what to make of this.
And another thing that's not clear is actually rare earths. We've seen China weaponize rare earths, sending the U.S. to its knees when it withheld those supplies. I'm just wondering, do you see China doing that again?
That is a tremendous leverage point of holding a choke point in the global economy, in a critical area that is affecting so many relevant and upcoming technologies and industries. There's no reason why China would give up that particular leverage, from my point of view.
And what can the U.S. do? The U.S. has talked about perhaps, producing its own 100,000 batteries annually, which is half of what the world needs in 3 years. Is that even realistic? I mean, what is the path forward for rare earths for the U.S.?
I think it's going to be really hard. We, the United States and the rest of the world, have allowed for China to develop this completely dominant position in the global market on rare earths. And it's not that it's a problem that caught us by surprise. In fact, in the early 2010s, when I was at USTR the first time around as the chief counsel for China trade enforcement, I led a team that litigated a WTO case, that's at the World Trade Organization, against China on export restrictions the Chinese had placed on rare earths. We won that case, but looking back, we clearly won the battle, but are losing the overall struggle, because today the United States and similarly situated countries in the rest of the world are actually worse off when it comes to access to Chinese rare earths or rare earths in general. And I think a really important aspect of this, which speaks to the larger challenge of trade relations with China for the United States and for much of the rest of the world, is that this version of globalization, of trade liberalization that we have been pursuing for the last 45 years, has resulted in a massive concentration and consolidation, not just in rare earths, but across multiple really strategic sectors China now holds as choke points. And for the rest of us then, the question is, what are the hard truths, the hard conversations we need to have with ourselves and with Beijing in order to evolve our situation so that we can turn down the dial on geopolitical temperatures and pressures so that there can be more resilience and more supply chains that run through more parts of the world. And I think I see evidence of some of that work coming from the Trump administration. It is entirely unclear to me whether any of that is being taken up in these conversations.
Do you see a different China? Is this a China that's more confident because it is dominant in the space of rare earths?
Again, not just rare earths, right? Solar panels that we've seen over time, EVs and EV batteries. I think this goes to a diagnosis that had become very, very clear, certainly at the end of the Biden administration, which is around the over buildup of capacity in China in all kinds of manufacturing sectors. And the linking of the reality today that China is responding to its own economic challenges by doubling down on its dominance as a manufacturer, threatening a second China shock for the United States and the rest of the world, with all of the concomitant challenges to jobs, to communities, to industries, and to domestic politics. And what I find very interesting is that with all of the rhetorical talk that members of the Trump administration will parrot around advancing economic and trade policies in favor of the working person and working class, none of that is on display, and very little of that conversation around the China shock that is here in its second iteration, or the need to respond to this doubling down in terms of China's export dominance. None of that has really been in the mainstream conversation. And my fear is that none of that is actually being addressed in Beijing at this opportunity between the two leaders.
Ambassador Tai, I also want to touch on the 301 tariffs. What's the status of those tariffs? Are they indeed undermining U.S. competitiveness?
Let me answer the first part of your question first, which is there are a lot of 301 tariffs. They're the ones that were applied in 2018. Those were the ones that were China-facing. There have been 76 301 investigations that USTR initiated about 2 months ago in the middle of March, about 2 weeks after the IEEPA tariffs were declared unconstitutional and the Section 122 tariffs were put in their place. My expectation is that these investigations will probably wrap up with remedies announced in time for the Section 122 tariffs to either expire at the end of July or to be declared potentially unconstitutional again by the U.S. court system. When it comes to those new 301 tariffs, again, there are 76 investigations that are looking at 60 different trading partners. China is facing two sets of investigations, one for the overcapacity in manufacturing sectors, and the second one for failing to have a forced labor import ban. I think that in the conversation with Ambassador Greer, the question about what should happen if those investigations turn into tariffs and whether or not that will implicate the Busan Truce, I think you saw Ambassador Greer really be restrained in his response. But my reading between the lines is that inevitably, should those investigations come out and manifest new tariffs that are directed at China, that those absolutely will impact the Busan Truce and the dynamics going into any potential fall return state visit.
How about in terms of how perhaps the 301 tariffs are making the U.S. Less competitive? I mean, it does add to import costs, especially manufacturing and AI. What's your take on that?
I don't know how you separate 301 tariffs from the IEEPA tariffs, from the 232 tariffs. We are living in a very, very heavy tariff environment. And as a former trade representative and someone who has made my way in the world, really focused on trade policy, the tariff for me is just a tool to accomplish an objective. And I think that the question for the United States under this second Trump term today is, what are all of these tariffs supposed to be accomplishing? And that also is not clear to me.
Ambassador Tai, just one final question, and in 30 seconds before we wrap it up, I'm just wondering, what's the biggest risk out there in terms of relations between the U.S. and China right now? What keeps you up at night?
My concern is that this administration fails to deliver on a coherent policy with clear principles that are keyed to learning lessons from the past. We cannot afford to keep making the same mistakes over and over and over. The mistakes that we've made in the past have led us to today, which is a less peaceful, less and potentially less prosperous world.